Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Research America Alliance member webinar. And of course, we thank you for joining us. And as we're wrapping up the summer, although as my husband reminds me, we still have a whole month to go. And we thank you for your ongoing partnership. I'm so excited about our guest today, Brian Southwell, an expert on combating misinformation and disinformation. And I'm also eager to understand the difference between the mis and the dis. He's the Senior Director of the Science in the Public Sphere program in the Center for Communications at RTI International. And he's also a professor at Duke and UNC Chapel Hill. So as usual, please type your questions into the Q&A box as we go along, and we will have plenty of time for Q&A after we hear Brian's presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Brian. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. And thanks to you all. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with everybody. I did want to offer a few remarks to set the stage here, but I am looking forward to our discussion as well. And so I appreciate everybody's interest in this topic. It does seem to be a popular one because it is such an important threat and challenge in this moment. So let me just share screen here and I will put some remarks up. Okay, so this is a moment when there certainly has been a spotlight on misinformation, medical misinformation, and health information specifically. We saw that with the recent Surgeon General's report and advisory on health misinformation as a threat to public health. And we talk about all the reasons for that. This has been at least a few years coming, as well. There's certainly been a popular focus on misinformation as a concern. A few years ago, for example, the Washington Post actually named misinformation as its word of the year, and a number of other media outlets made similar announcements around that time. And so we've had a few years where, in fact, misinformation has been a dire concern. We've seen this reflected in academic literature as well, pardon me, in which there has been a flurry of academic publication on misinformation. My group has contributed to some of that, and we've asked questions about why it is that misinformation spreads as it does, and how we might stop people from sharing misinformation. What could we possibly do to mitigate the effects? But it's really important, I think, to put all of this into a larger historical context as well, because actually misinformation itself is not new. As long as people have talked to each other, pretty much for that same duration, they've been able to deceive each other or to lie to one another. So we've had that capacity for human history. But even if we just think within the context of mass media and electronic media, there are myriad examples of misinformation and medical misinformation specifically. One of them that I like to highlight relates to a turn of phrase that many of you are familiar with, the whole notion of a snake oil salesman. Turns out that was actually rooted in a historical situation in which there was fraudulent peddling of snake oil liniment. This was actually what led to some early regulation of medical advertisements. And there was a lot of worry and concern at that time. You move ahead in time from that, in the late 1930s, the US had the War of the Worlds incident in which people inadvertently tuned into the Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater Players giving a dramatization of the H.G. Wells novel, The War of the Worlds, but they missed the introduction in some cases, and that was a very realistic production. People got the impression, or the misimpression, that people were aliens were invading New Jersey. So this has been a concern for a while. There are more recent examples that I want to talk about here as well. But one cartoon that you've seen perhaps circulating social media recently highlights the fact that we've been worried about misinformation for decades and decades. Here's a cartoon from the 1930s in which there is a direct concern about misinformation in the context of smallpox and the struggles with vaccination perceptions at that point in time. So this has been with us for a while. And it's important for us to recognize that part of our solution, part of the way forward, actually should be rooted in this recognition of our humanity and understanding of longstanding aspects of human dynamics. So I tend to think about the situation, the problem, the dilemma as reflecting at least a few core observations and realizations. I want to just briefly put those on the table. The first is that as humans, we're biased towards the acceptance of misinformation and information at face value. I'll talk about that in just a second. There are really good reasons why, as social beings, we share information that have to do with more than just the strict, truth of that information. We are social animals, and it's important to recognize how information flows. We live in a democracy in the U.S. and in countries like ours. There's often a regulatory approach that, at best, and there are good reasons for this, emphasizes what we might think of as post hoc detection of misinformation rather than sanitization or censoring of misinformation. So it's possible in this kind of leaky environment for misinformation to be out there. We can do something about it. We can address it, but we can't necessarily protect people from being able to find it altogether. That's really important as a realization, I think, in a situation like we live in the US. And we also know that it's possible to counteract misperceptions. It's possible to overturn them, but it's difficult. It takes hard work. It takes a lot of resources. And it's important to realize that it's not a matter of just flipping a switch or snapping fingers. That correction of misperceptions stemming from misinformation takes some work. So I want to just put a bit more elaboration on some of those points. This notion, and this is important because I think what I want to emphasize today is our need for compassion and empathy for our fellow human beings. And one important source of that compassion is the realization that we all are vulnerable to misinformation. This goes back to a longstanding debate between a couple of philosophers who are thinking about psychology in different ways, Spinoza and Descartes. Descartes essentially gave us a lot of credit as being able to filter out and not really have to deal with misinformation when we encountered it. Spinoza took a more nuanced approach to this and said, actually, we take all information in, we essentially process it as being true, and then we've got capacity for determining whether it's true or false. So just that slight step, that slight hesitation leaves the door open later, now, for a quick click of the button where you might spread misinformation on your social media feed before you've really had a chance to critically engage it. That's important. And there's a lot of empirical evidence that suggests that Spinoza was right, that actually we do tend to take in information, process it, and then we can have critical capacity for engaging with it. But under some circumstances, we're tired or fatigued, or we just don't necessarily bother, and we continue to accept it at face value. I also want to point to us as audiences. And another way to do that is to think about an example situation that happened in Australia a few years ago. Some of you might be familiar with the story of Belle Gibson, but her story is one that is really quite relevant to what we want to talk about here today. Belle Gibson rose to fame, or rather infamy, in Australia by virtue of her advocacy and her touting of we'll call it nutritional method for overcoming cancer that she supposedly used in her own situation. Unfortunately, Belle Gibson acted as though she had cancer and overcame it. She didn't actually ever have cancer. She was a fraud in that regard. And there's a lot that we might judge in terms of the ethics of what Belle Gibson did. But what I also think is important for us is for us to realize what the Belle Gibson story tells us about our own humanity and about ourselves. And I think that for our discussion, there are really 2 points that I want to draw out that are really important. I think there's aspects of our humanity that I think we tend to overlook. That is, as we've just talked about, we do need social connection. We've certainly seen that during the pandemic. We hunger for it. It's been difficult to be disconnected from people. And we need to find ways to talk with each other. And information is currency for relationships. And misinformation can be too, especially when it seems to offer hope or seems to offer something to gossip with your friend or family member about. And that's important. Second, we need hope for the future. We need this as human beings. And in situations where we're lacking social connection, where we're lacking hope, where perhaps we feel alienated, Misinformation sometimes can offer salve for both of those. Misinformation can be crafted in a way that actually seems to suggest there is a bright light and a path forward. It might give us something to talk about, to signal our identity in a community with other people, even if it may not turn out to be true. And that's important. And I think we see this in the way that certain incidents of misinformation have spread. I want to look at one example here just to kind of put a finer point on this. And this is a situation that actually arose in the context of journalism. And there was a somewhat misleading headline and story that suggested that perhaps a cure for cancer had been found a couple of years ago. And actually this spread relatively quickly through various other media outlets. And so you see that this was something that got picked up and covered by a number of other outlets quickly. And it also spread through social media in different ways. And that's where I want to pay attention to this story for just a moment, because of the nature and tone of how it spread through social media. There was an awful lot of emotion in these posts, and positive emotion, hopeful emotion, desperation in different ways. And that's important for us to keep in mind, that when we talk about the spread of misinformation, it's not devoid of emotion. In fact, it actually it tends to involve it quite a bit. I also want to think about, not only in this case, what happened with the spread of that story, but also what happened with a story that was published the next day to correct some of that that was perhaps misstated, or at least a follow-up. And what you see in the context of Forbes that reran the story, there was a direct day-by-day comparison of the original story touting a cure, and then a story that basically offered some caveats. The story that offered the cure was shared almost 1 million times, and at a much lower rate, the story with correction was shared many fewer times. And so I think that's really important for us to keep in mind, but because there's something about the caveated nature, the weighted nature of the corrective story, that there's something different that was less likely to be shared. We can ask a question here then also about whether our emotions make us vulnerable. And the short answer is yes. There's some really great work that was done by a former graduate student of mine, Brian Weeks, who suggested and found that anger, for example, can encourage the acceptance of inaccurate information. You can imagine the implications of that for the landscape that we're in currently. So we can ask questions then about what to do about all this. And I want to talk about that in our discussion here today. But the short answer I have for this is that we need to encourage empathy and compassion. We do need to think about how we can help people navigate a complicated media landscape, and what can we do to translate scientific information into information that's accessible for people. We've got to also do a better job of figuring out what people are encountering, even if we might look down our nose at it. How well are we monitoring the information environments people are facing, so that we can keep an eye on misinformation as it might be popping up. And we've got to find ways to empower people to do a better job in terms of their own information seeking. In a nutshell, we need to focus perhaps more on building trust, perhaps less on blaming those who don't trust us. So just a quick word as to what trust really can mean here, and then we'll transition to questions here in just a minute. I want us to just realize that trust is something that might have to do with the factual accuracy of sources. And so certainly perceptions of credibility matter. But we also know that consistency and reliability matter in sources of information, as well as perceptions of shared interest. To what extent do you have a sense that a particular information source shares some interest or cares about your well-being? And that's something that I think is really important here ultimately, because I think one of our ways through this landscape is to not only think about addressing misinformation as it's out there, but also attracting people to information as we're presenting it. It's something we talked about a few years ago in a summit that we put together on trust in science that suggests that we've got to think about the relationship that we have with different audiences. Promotion of open science is something that a lot of people suggest in terms of thinking about the transparency of our work. We also think that need to think about how scientists themselves can be a part of the equation in different ways and to become better communicators. And we also need to think in ways that I really appreciate on a moment like this to think about encouraging collaboration between organizations. And so we need to share all of our best tactics and tools, and I'm happy to do that. I want to just put a spotlight on two of those that we've developed here locally. The first of these is a training program that we've worked on for clinicians, in which we have attempted to try to distill some of these ideas and to encourage clinicians to think about how to work with their patients to help them avoid misinformation, not in a shaming and blaming kind of way, but in a way that actually really tries to draw out what their values are, to try to steer them towards more positive information by having dialogue and discussion. We actually have developed this as a virtual offering. We've been holding workshops all this spring. So if people are interested, I can share that URL with you later. But we've got this program over at Duke University that's been really compelling. And then people have also been attempting to put a spotlight on the need for us to not just stand up and say this is wrong with regards to misinformation, but to think about how to embrace and work together for different viewpoints. And so I was recently interviewed for a new documentary that is being distributed by PBS this summer that encapsulates some of these ideas. And so I'll just provide that URL as well that some of you might be interested in. And that I think the premiere is happening this week in some stations in New Mexico, and stations nationwide are likely to draw that in for the summer and fall. So I'm happy to have this be part of a larger conversation here. Certainly feel free to follow up with me at RTI International or at Duke. And I'd be happy to talk more. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen, Jenny. Stop talking so quickly, and I'll be happy to talk about questions people might have.
I'm from New Jersey, so you did not talk quickly.
And I'm from New York, and so
okay,
I get a hard time about it in North Carolina a lot of times.
Yeah. Well, this was such a great presentation. I mean, you raised so many of the issues that we've been mulling over and discussing and concerned about, during the pandemic. There's an interesting paradox that you point out, that our polling and a lot of other polling shows, including a recent Gallup poll, that the public still has a lot of trust in scientists. So it seems like, in a sense, what you're doing is you're providing some tools for scientists to better deploy that trust. And I guess I'm not asking a question, but making a statement. But I wondered if you could just comment on how scientists can use the trust that the public already has to our advantage.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you raising that, Jenny. And I actually have the good fortune and honor to also be working with the National Science Foundation on their updating of their biennial reporting on public perceptions of trust, and certainly something that we see. It's an important thing, that aspect of the public opinion landscape that gets overlooked by some of the headlines, is that people generally trust their healthcare provider, and generally there's still trust in scientists. And in fact, there are ways in which perhaps that's even been increased under some circumstances, as people have celebrated the arrival of vaccines at the same time that there's been some questions and discussion. That's important. And so we tend to think about this as a matter of building and maintaining trust, and really emphasizing that it's important to think about that maintenance of trust. I think that there are ways in which we could be doing a better job of capitalizing on some of the relationships that that we have. There are specific circumstances where people, I think, get led astray, and we've got misinformation spreading or complicating decision making. But if you assume the best in terms of people's ability to trust in and have some faith in scientific processes and institutions, that leaves you in a better spot, in a different spot in terms of addressing this. So rather than assuming, and this is something that I've emphasized in other discussions and panels, we fall into a trap, I think, by using war metaphors in terms of thinking about misinformation. So if we're going to combat misinformation, means the threat is out there. We need to somehow go out and vanquish it from the internet. We got to go toe to toe with all this. And yes, it is a persistent concern. There's a lot of noise and inaccurate information. It's a mess on some level. We've got to worry about that. But by going to war, we're missing the opportunity to shore up the people that we're trying to serve and that we can collaborate with. And so I think instead we might think about building relationships where you're continuing to provide trusted information to people who are just trying to keep themselves healthy, their families healthy. And that's really the bigger challenge. It doesn't mean that there isn't sort of a blowing wind that we've got to deal with, but what can we do to shore up what we're doing in terms of our communities? I think that would be, to me, the better move. Rather than the metaphor, the old carnival game of whack-a-mole. I think you're sort of doing that sometimes if you're trying to just fact check everything that's out there. I think you'd be better off, what can we do to kind of get people with a steady information diet with their trusted institutions? And I think that's probably a smarter way to go.
Terrific. Well, I think we have a number of questions from the audience.
Okay.
So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague.
Hi, Jenny. Yes, we do have a number of questions here. So just as a reminder to folks, if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to put it into the Q&A or the chat, and we will make sure your question gets asked if we have time. So Brian, one question that has come in, are there common themes you see with the spread of misinformation specifically pertaining to COVID-19? And this person said that you recently wrote an interesting blog in Scientific American about what we can actually learn from the misinformation. Could you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is important, I think, to recognize that not all information is equal. There's a lot of it that's out there. Some of it might be more problematic in terms of its direct implication or invitation to participate in dangerous behavior, and others might be less or more innocuous in different ways. We certainly see there are different themes, and if you think about worry and concern about side effects, that's sort of a group of concerns with regards to vaccination, for example. There are broader ideas about conspiracies of relationships between institutions and different actions. And some of it is just actually more mundane in terms of people pointing to outdated information. One of the challenges we faced during this pandemic is the fact that information has evolved. And so you might share something that was earnestly put forward and maybe even accurate on some level according to consensus 2 years ago or a year ago that no longer is. And so I think part of what we need to do is really emphasize the degree to which science is a process, getting people ready for the idea that things may change or evolve somewhat over time. That's hard for audiences to accept. Honestly, I think we've got to be more compassionate about that because it's hard for people to keep up sometimes. But I think part of what we can learn is by looking at what kinds of information and misinformation spread. There are certain values people are trying to express, and some of it has to do with personal safety. Some of it has to do with their longstanding relationship, with different institutions. Some of it has to do with larger worldviews. It's usually about more than the specific incident at hand. So if we ask and investigate and think about that, we can better address and craft our responses or provide people information that speaks to those needs and values rather than just fact checking everything to death and sort of, that's where I worry that people are wanting to pull, peer reviewed articles and say, well, here are the 18 reasons why this is wrong. But perhaps what's most important is, well, why was this Facebook group excited about this in the first place? What can we do to provide accurate information that speaks to that concern or that value? And I think a lot of it has been, specifically during the pandemic, people have just been exhausted and tired and scared and wanting this to go away and have been in denial about things. And that has invited in some vulnerability to less than accurate information under some circumstances. So yeah, it's a good question.
Anna, I think we have a few more questions from the audience.
Yes, we certainly do. So another question, Brian, is what are the legal statutes being engaged or maybe revised or perhaps being stretched in this current climate of misinformation and disinformation?
Yeah, well, so from an information regulation standpoint, it's important to recognize that our different types of media outlets, it's not all the same in terms of, if you think about, regulation and what happens in a broadcast, television, context is different than what you might find in the far reaches of a search online, and that's important for people to keep in mind, because our regulatory structure deals with certain aspects, and then there's other aspects. The internet sort of complicates things, and it's a bit of, and that's important to realize, that if you've got a regulatory approach that's focused on print advertisements and television ads, and other aspects of what happens in a television program, that's a little bit different than something you might read on a blog somewhere. Generally speaking, it's also, this goes to the earlier point here, there's a balancing act. And I want to be, careful to not offer a political, view on this, one or the other. But it is important just to recognize the precedent that we have, for valuing free speech in different ways, and just to point out that, some degree of restriction at times can have inadvertent effects in terms of, clamping down on that. That said, we also have a tradition in this country of, news organizations and media outlets having some responsibility, for what's presented and what flows through their channels and platforms in different ways, and that seems to be affecting the debate and the discussion. And it's important to keep that in mind. That I think that having a sense of ethical responsibility, to avoid problematic, content, knowingly inaccurate content is important as well.
Brian, that directly leads into a question that has to do with a study from the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which I'm sure you're familiar with, found that the majority of COVID-19 vaccine misinformation came from just 12 people. Yeah. So how do we utilize that knowledge? If they were on broadcast TV, they'd be subject to the fairness doctrine and other regulations. Is that where we would then put the energy that you're talking about in terms of trying to, clamp down on some misinformation? Because you clearly are focused more on the receiving end, right?
Yeah.
But on the people who are turning it out end, would that be one way to structure the response, to really focus on the biggest offenders?
Yeah, so there's a couple things to keep in mind here. Even aside from regulation, there are choices that are being made, as to who's allowed to do what, right? And so if you think about, organizing a platform, there are choices that get made, there, and choices can continue to be made. And so I think that, that would be a good reason to consider, whether or not certain accounts are allowed to continue to function if they're certainly clearly functioning in this way. It's also the network, the nature, the extent to which a few sources can get distributed widely. It's a fascinating aspect of the mathematics of social networks, in which you can see here ways that what's important about that, though, Jenny, is yes, maybe a few sources are responsible in an outsized way. But at the same time, that wouldn't happen if there wasn't diffusion and referral and sharing, right? And so that's important as well, to realize that we're still all implicated in this. And I think if we could clamp down on some of the redistribution and sharing, I think that also would help in important ways. I don't know. It's interesting, as to what gets classified. I actually think that one of the reasons we use the word misinformation, and this goes to your earlier opening comment, is to think about misinformation as an umbrella, under which disinformation is a subset. And so disinformation we often think about as that which we know is actively authored where there was intention to deceive. And that's certainly an important component. But there's also misinformation that's inadvertent, that there are honest mistakes that happen in journalism, over time. There is noise out there, there's misleading or maybe instances in which something isn't sort of fully or wholly accurate. And all of that can be problematic so in different ways. So I worry about, yes, those dramatic in situations where there's a handful, but there's also an awful lot that even if you were to take away those dozen, there still would be an imperfect information environment. And how can we do to help people better navigate that? I think is important to keep in mind too. Yeah.
That's terrific. Anna, I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, I think one additional question, Brian. So you mentioned this earlier that, in the case of the pandemic, some early information was, later proven inaccurate, or not what folks kind of thought was the case or what was happening.
Yeah.
So are there any best practices for, managing information that can change to try to minimize the prospect of it then becoming misinformation or disinformation later on?
Yeah. So this brings to mind some really interesting work that's been done around algorithmic placement, on some of those social media platforms, instances where certain content is met with other links along the side to say, well, this is also relevant and has been updated. And I think that it's worth all organizations, thinking about what they can do to ensure, continual updating to, in which things are linked, or if the later version, you think about what happens with the stories as they get updated, in a news platform, and there's a correction at the bottom, or later updating, or a note that this was edited, and what can be done to ensure that happens. It's a lot of work, but this is actually some place where we talk about worry and threat. Sometimes with regards to artificial intelligence or other, but I actually think there are instances where some of this, there's some possibility for automation to make sure that we've got kind of closed loops, and instances where older versions are, even if they're left up for archival purposes, there's a link to show that something has been updated. I think there's some interesting work that can be done there. I'd encourage people that are on the call to think about that, because I think we need to do a lot of work together to kind of clean up what's out there. There's a lot of remnants of old conversations and things that then get repurposed into credible looking social media posts. And so what can we do short of just cleaning up and taking all of them down? Could we actually contextualize or provide links, or to try to update things as much as possible? That's on us partly to do. I think that could be helpful. Yeah.
That's great. Well, wow, what a wonderful conversation. And you mentioned a number of tools towards the end of your presentation that are particularly helpful to folks in the public health community and in the science communication arena. So we'll make those available. If you can put them in the chat now, Brian, that's great. Otherwise, we will circulate them.
Yeah. I can do that.
All right.
Yep. Great.
That's great. Well, thank you. While you're putting them in the chat, I am going to make a couple of announcements. But this was just terrific. And I think we're going to have fun circulating the recording of this as well.
Great.
So one quick housekeeping item before everyone goes. We're taking the month of August off from our Alliance member meetings, realizing that hopefully most of you are taking well-deserved vacations, but we're already getting guest speakers lined up for September, as well as working on our National Research Forum, which this year will be virtual, like last year, September 13th, 14th, and 15th. And we'll be sending out registration information in the next couple of weeks. It's going to be full of just great conversations that I don't think you're going to want to miss. So with that, have a great rest of the day. Goodbye. And Brian, since you're still on screen, I'll wave goodbye to you, and thank you once more for a great discussion.
Great. Thanks, everybody.